Shalom, everyone. The Sovereignty Movement has launched a series of Zoom meetings and interviews with public opinion leaders to analyze the situation to its fullest and lead to Israel's victory over our enemies. And this time, we have the pleasure and honor of being with Rabbi Stephen Pruzansky, originally from Teaneck, New Jersey, Rabbi of Bnei Shurun community, who made Aliyah in 2020, Senior Research Associate for the Jerusalem Center for Applied Policy. Shalom, Rabbi Pruzansky.
Shalom, Erev Tov.
Erev Tov. So let's start immediately with a difficult question about morality. We hear a lot about morality. The world likes to tell Israel what they think is moral for us. And our question is to you, Rabbi, where do we draw our moral strength from? And is there an innocent population in Gaza?
It's a tough question only because many people don't want to hear the right answer. But obviously, the morality of the Jewish people has to stem from the Torah and from the traditions of the Jewish people. And the morality of the Torah does not change because God, who's the author of that morality, also does not change. Western morality is essentially based on the Judeo-Christian ethic, as is Western civilization. But Western civilization, and even what they call the Judeo-Christian ethic, borrowed many concepts from Judaism, from the Torah, but missing its essence, missing its substance. And therefore, we see that Western morality becomes quite subjective and fluid, and it changes over time. As we saw, since the Geneva Conventions were adopted in the 1860s, they constantly refine it, but in such a way that they wind up hampering the forces of good and benefiting the forces of evil. So as I see it today, the Western morality is no longer objective. And as a result, much of it is only applied to Israel in a coercive manner. We don't see themselves, the Western nations, limiting themselves in their conduct of war. Certainly, we go back to World War II and see the way the Allies, whether the British or the Americans, almost paid no attention to the fate of German or Japanese civilians, which resulted in tens of thousands of them being killed in airstrikes in very short periods of time, between 1 day and 7 days, whether Hamburg or Dresden or Hiroshima or Nagasaki or other places as well. So we should emphasize that the ethics of war, as found in the West, are almost always adjudicated after the battle is won, not in the middle of the battle, as they're trying to force Israel to do, micromanaging where every bomb is going to be fired, lest a civilian who's been placed inside the Hamas terror network is going to be harmed. Our morality is not based on those types of ethics, but on the Torah ethics, which above all prizes Jewish life.
And about the question about the innocent population in Gaza.
I'm inclined to believe and accept what Winston Churchill said when he was asked a similar question during World War II, aren't there innocent civilians in Germany? And he said in these words, there are no innocent civilians in Germany, period. And he understood that the German people are responsible for what their government does, just like the people of Gaza are responsible for what their government does. This dichotomy that exists in the West and especially in the media, even in governments such as in America or Britain or France, that tries to distinguish between Hamas and Gaza, it's false, it's contrived, it's artificial, because the people of Gaza voted for Hamas in 2006. All right, they seized power and expelled Fatah a year later, but that's the way it is in the Arab world. The fact is, they voted for Hamas, knowing that Hamas was a genocidal organization, as defined in its charter, dedicated to the destruction of the state of Israel and the elimination of every Jew throughout the world. It's important to mention that, are they innocent civilians? It's very hard to draw that conclusion, and I'll explain why. So first of all, they voted for them. Second of all, many participated. Many of these so-called innocent civilians participated in the massacre of October 7th. And the rest of them cheered and celebrated and distributed sweets and candies to the children because they had the very macabre pleasure of seeing videos of Jews being massacred. They're not so innocent. The terrorist who phoned home to boast to his father that he had killed 10 Jews and said, look what your son did. Tell mom, I killed 10 Jews with my own hands. Those parents are not innocent civilians. They raised a monster. So who's to say they're not monsters themselves? And after all, I would say, thirdly, it's not just that they voted for them, but if they really objected to being under the rule of a genocidal organization, they would have revolted over the years, just like the Americans revolted, and the French revolted, and the Bolsheviks revolted. History is replete with examples of populations overthrowing their cruel, despotic masters. The fact that there's no attempt even to do that, no movement, not even a single dissenting word, tells us innocent. And we should consider one other thing also. Has anyone heard even a word emanating from Gaza, from any of these so-called innocent civilians, that the massacre was wrong, disgraceful, an embarrassment to Islam? We should be doing soul searching. How could such people have emerged from our midst? Not even one word, not even with their identity concealed and their voice concealed, so that's subject to repercussions. Not even one word of objection. What do they object to? Yeah, they object to the consequences that are befalling them because of the massacre and terror perpetrated by the people they voted into power. Sure, you're going to have infants that obviously are innocent, but it's worthy to note that the same argument was raised in 2008 during Tzuk Eitan. How could you bomb innocent children? And 15 years later, those innocent children are the ones who perpetrated the massacre. And Amalek is Amalek. Amalek defined as a nation and ideology that's dedicated to the eradication of the Jewish people and the ideas we brought to the world. And in the mitzvah of eliminating Amalek, we don't distinguish between anyone, any person, because it's the ideology that we pass down from generation to generation.
The laws of war in The Hague, according to which moral code were they written? What is it all about?
I think it was fabricated by well-meaning people trying to civilize war, which is an inherently uncivil process. War is hell. War is violent. War is not pretty. And so here you had a group of people of liberal bent trying to somehow civilize what's inherently uncivil. And I think what it's become in its various conventions, I think it's up to the 5th convention now, and The Hague produced other conventions. It's a formula basically never to defeat an evil enemy. So therefore it's based on a distortion of reality and actually the opposite of what ethics should be. And essentially, I think what should irritate and aggravate every Israeli and every fair person is the Geneva Conventions and the Hague Conventions, especially as they relate to civilians, should only exist or be honored in the context of mutuality or reciprocity. If there's no reciprocity, meaning only one side is held to the standard and not the other side, that's a formula for disaster, because all it does is strengthen the cruel, barbaric enemy who is not heeding to any international law or any international regulation. And that's what we've confronted, and sadly, we've accepted over these many, many decades, the fact that we have to be limited, whereas our enemy doesn't. And I'll hasten to add, not being limited by the Geneva Convention and the Convention on Civilians doesn't mean we have to intentionally bomb civilians indiscriminately, because that's not part of our culture or our morality. But as collateral damage, when the enemy is using them as human shields, if you hamstring the good people, well, the evildoers are going to triumph. And I think it's important for the listeners to note that in the absence of any type of reciprocity, this is what will prohibit soldiers from fighting out of uniform, unless they're spies. You can't fight out of uniform because that makes a fair fight. This way you're able to distinguish between civilians and combatants. I mean, we live with this because let's say you have a terrorist walking on the streets of Yerushalayim, God forbid, in civilian clothes with a knife. Until he pulls that knife, he's an innocent civilian. And if someone would try to preempt him, knowingly accused of being a civilian, no, that's wrong. The conventions are quite explicit. No soldier can fight out of uniform. Of course, it's forbidden to fight from a civilian location. And here Hamas uses these civilians as their human shields. And obviously, it's forbidden to murder and rape and capture and torture civilians or even soldiers, such that like they did on October 7th. And of course, it's forbidden to keep civilians in captivity without visits from the Red Cross, and many, many other such regulations that are completely ignored by the enemy, by the cruel terrorist Hamas, and therefore they have the advantage because they use these laws against us with their accomplices in the media, because they know that the more we are limited in our response, the more they're able to survive and continue to perpetrate their evil. So to adhere to these principles without any reciprocity is actually a formula for stalemate or defeat. And stalemate is what we have because we see America hasn't won a war in 80 years because it slips up on the tread of these types of laws and principles that are applied to us, to good people, but never to the evildoers.
Lastly, what would be considered in your eyes as a victory for this war?
So here I'm inclined to agree with what the government said at the very outset of the war. The first principle has to be the destruction of Hamas, the devastation of their military capabilities, and the utter elimination of any type of sovereignty or governance they had over the Gaza Strip. That's the first objective. The second objective has to be the return of the hostages safe and sound to their homes. Just as an analyst, I mean, our sympathies, of course, are with the families, as are our prayers. We have to admit those two objectives are somewhat incompatible without a miracle from heaven. As we saw, the miracle can be an open miracle or a hidden miracle. But just like we recovered last week, the body of Noah Marciano, Hashem Yikam Dama, the terrorists killed her. I'm afraid that attempts to free the hostages, military attempts, will also result in their deaths. There's some incompatibility between those two objectives, but nonetheless, we have to try. And after this, it's impossible, unacceptable that there should be in Gaza any type of foreign sovereignty or foreign rule. It's not just the preposterous illusion that the Palestinian Authority should be the rulers there, as Joe Biden and Tony Blinken have been saying now for the last 2 weeks. That's hallucinatory. It is not worth the life of even one Jewish soldier in Gaza if the outcome is handing Gaza to the Palestinian Authority, which, after all, we've seen that horror movie 18 years ago when they were in possession of it and they immediately lost it to Hamas. And besides, they're a corrupt kleptocracy that can barely manage their own affairs where they are now. Why reward them with more territory? And after that, we have to see, obviously, the return and the rebuilding and the flourishing of all the communities in the Gaza envelope. And then, obviously, we don't have to announce it now or broadcast it, but to return the settlements to Gush Katif, to the extent that they want to. And it's important to emphasize that as it is today, and we see the images and the pictures on television, the Gaza Strip in many parts is now uninhabitable, even to its former residents. Nobody can live there. So the Gazans who were there, certainly on the northern part of Gaza, in Gaza City, in Beit Hanun, in Jabalia, etc., there are no homes. There are no apartments. There's no infrastructure. There's no industry. There's no economy. There's nothing there. So to what will they return? And to allow them to return is going to mean, at a certain point, because the ideology is not ending just because the war ends, it's going to mean ultimately the rebuilding of some military capability. And what you'll find also an insurgency in Gaza. Snipers will take out soldiers or other people living there, and that, of course, is unacceptable to us. So the best outcome really would be, and how it happens, I'll leave to wiser heads, but it's not something that is impossible, that the present Gazan residents, who, truth be told, fancy themselves as refugees for 75 years or 56 years, however you look at it, they have to be resettled in other countries, whether are other Arab countries, in Western countries. Danny Danone wrote this in the Wall Street Journal last week, Ram Ben Barak.
Relocation.
He suggested let 20,000 Gazan residents be resettled in 100 countries across the world. They're not that many in any event, but let's say they each take 15,000, 100 countries. You would think it's a solution that would work primarily for them if they want to have decent lives not dedicated to the elimination of Jewish life with the Jewish state. It's good for them, it's good for Israel, and it's really good for the world as well.
Thank you very much, Rabbi Pruzansky. It was very interesting. And shalom, shalom. And may we have good news, please God.
Amen. Thank you very much.